The sky above Fortress World Karsus 9 was a dying ember, streaked with the wreckage of 1,000 warships burning in the void. The planetary shields flickered, struggling to hold against the relentless assault of the abyssal swarm. Across the world's surface, soldiers fought battles that had already been lost, their weapons carving through eldritch horrors that refused to stay dead. Inside the Citadel's war chamber, the last leaders of humanity gathered in desperation. Supreme Strategos Dianmaros, the highest-ranking commander of the Dominion of Mankind, stood before a holotable flickering with the grim reality of their situation. The abyss had overrun every stronghold before Karsus 9. Every fleet deployed had been consumed. Every plan, every countermeasure had failed. Humanity was out of time. "We have exhausted every option," said General Rylos, his voice hoarse from weeks without sleep. "There is no strategy left. No reinforcement coming." "We have one option," Meros said, his voice cold as steel. He tapped a control panel, and a new display materialized. Not a battle plan, not a fleet formation. A single classified file, marked HFY. The room fell silent. "You're insane," whispered Admiral Korsk, staring at the file as if it might reach out and strangle him. "We banned this technology for a reason." "It was banned because no one wanted to pay the price," Meros said, scanning the faces of his commanders. "But now we either pay it, or we die." The file opened, revealing a list of names spoken in hushed reverence by war historians, names that had shaped entire eras of combat, names of the greatest warriors humanity had ever known. And beside each name was a designation: deceased. "This is impossible," said High Tactician Varen. "Even if we had their DNA, even if we had neural imprints, resurrecting them would create husks, not leaders." Meros gestured to the room's far wall, where a massive containment chamber stood sealed. Its thick, reinforced glass pulsed with the eerie glow of quantum necro-signatures. "We've spent centuries perfecting the process. They won't just be ghosts of their former selves. They will be them." "The process is unstable," Korsk growled. "We don't even know if they'll retain their minds, their identities. What if they wake up and turn against us?" "Then we shoot them," Meros said flatly. "But I think we all know that's not going to happen. These are the greatest warriors who ever lived. If anyone can save us, it's them." Silence. No one spoke. Outside, the planetary shields gave another shuddering ripple as an abyssal titan slammed against them. The world itself seemed to groan. Finally, General Rylos exhaled. "Do it." Meros nodded. "Activate the resurrection protocols. Bring them back." Deep beneath Karsus 9, ancient machinery rumbled to life. Stored DNA strands unfurled in vats of synthetic life gel. Neural patterns, extracted from history itself, were rewritten onto fresh minds. Cybernetic warforms hummed with power as they prepared to house the reborn titans of warfare. And then, in the darkness of the resurrection chamber, the first warrior opened his eyes. The containment chamber hissed as pressurized mist vented from its seams. Warning lights pulsed red along the chamber walls, casting eerie shadows over the scientists working frantically at their consoles. Status readouts scrolled across holographic displays, detailing the impossible: neural reconstruction at 98% stability, synthetic body integration at 100%, consciousness retrieval in progress. Then, with a final mechanical clank, the locks disengage. The first warrior awoke. A tall, armored figure stepped forward, exhaling a breath that had not belonged to a living man in centuries. His body, built for war, gleamed with advanced cybernetic augmentations, synthetic musculature wrapped in a reinforced combat exoskeleton. But it was his eyes, cold, calculating, aware, that froze everyone in place. High Marshal Saren Kane had returned. He raised a hand, flexing his fingers as if testing the sensation. His gaze swept the room, scanning every face with the precision of a battlefield tactician analyzing terrain. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, hardened growl. "This isn't my war," Kane said. "Explain why I'm here." Before anyone could answer, the second chamber burst open. General Victoria Voss emerged, her synthetic warform taller and heavier than Kane's, built for endurance and battlefield command. Her sharp blue eyes locked onto Kane with instant recognition. Unlike him, she did not question. She only understood. "Something's gone horribly wrong," she said, her voice calm, assessing. "Or else they wouldn't have woken us up." The third chamber opened. Admiral Elias Work strode forward, scanning the surroundings with the calculating intensity of a man who had once commanded entire interstellar armadas. His new body bore an interface directly linked to tactical fleet networks, his mind already processing incoming data from orbital sensors. One by one, more containment chambers unlocked. More figures stepped into the dim light, each of them legendary, each of them forged in wars long past. They had died once, and now they had returned. But something was different. Something lingered at the edges of their minds, like a whisper from the abyss. They remembered everything. Their deaths, the cold emptiness beyond, and something else, something that had watched them from the void. Meros stepped forward, careful to keep his stance firm. "High Marshal Kane, General Voss, Admiral Work, and all of you, welcome back to the Dominion. We have resurrected you because humanity faces extinction." Kane's expression did not change. "Who is the enemy?" Meros activated a holographic display. The image that appeared was not an army, nor a fleet. It was hunger made manifest. A swirling mass of darkness that consumed planets, twisting reality, leaving nothing behind. The abyssal swarm. Voss frowned. "Never seen anything like it." Meros tightened his fists. "No one has. And if you don't stop it, no one ever will." The room fell silent. Then Kane exhaled, his expression unreadable. "Brief us." The war was back on. The briefing room was silent as the Revenant generals absorbed the horror unfolding across the stars. The holographic display flickered, showing planet after planet consumed by the abyssal swarm. Massive tendrils of living darkness lashed out from the void, enveloping entire fleets in seconds. Soldiers caught in the abyssal corruption twisted into nightmarish forms, their screams turning into a chorus of inhuman wails. High Marshal Kane studied the footage with a cold, calculating stare. His mind, once sharpened by the brutal wars of old, worked through the information with the relentless precision of a war machine. Admiral Rourke stood with his arms crossed, eyes locked on the galactic war map, where what remained of the Dominion's fleet positions flickered like dying embers. "How long until the last fortress world falls?" Kane asked. "Less than 2 weeks," Meros admitted. "And that's if Karsus 9 holds." General Victoria Voss leaned forward, her fingers tapping against the table. "Conventional tactics have failed. If we fight them like any other enemy, we lose." Rourke narrowed his eyes. "We're not dealing with a conventional enemy. This thing," he gestured toward the abyssal mass displayed before them, "isn't just an empire or an army. It doesn't conquer. It devours. There are no supply lines to sever, no chain of command to disrupt. Every battle we fought, it adapts." Kane exhaled, considering the impossible. "Then we give it something it can't adapt to." Voss turned to him. "You have something in mind." Kane's expression was grim. "Total war." Meros frowned. "We've been fighting a total war." "No," Kane said. "You've been fighting like humans. That's why you're losing." He turned to the display and began marking strategic points in the Dominion's remaining territory. "We turn entire worlds into traps. We don't defend planets. We weaponize them, bake the abyss into attacking strongholds rigged with collapsible singularity bombs. Force it to devour void space dead zones poisoned with anti-neutrino payloads. We create battlegrounds where survival is impossible for anything, including us." Voss nodded, catching on. "Scorched Earth tactics on an interstellar scale." "Not just scorched Earth," Kane corrected. Scorched reality. We need to burn away everything the abyss can consume. Make it starve. Rourke folded his arms, intrigued. That might work for ground warfare, but space is different. We can't just lay traps in open void. Kane turned to him. Then you do what you do best. Make sure no one fights in open void. Rourke smirked. Fleet interdiction warfare. Tight engagements, gravitational distortions, controlled kill zones. We force it into battles it can't win. Marrow stared at them, a flicker of hope in his weary eyes. Can you do it? The Revenant generals looked at each other. Then Kane spoke. We didn't come back to lose. Voss cracked her knuckles. Let's show this thing what happens when it fights humanity's best. The war had just changed, and the abyss was about to learn fear. The first victories came at a terrible price. Across the warfront, humanity's counteroffensive unfolded like a brutal symphony of destruction. On the dead world of Tarsus V, General Voss turned the planet's crust into a fortress of collapsing tectonic plates, luring the abyssal swarm into a killing field of molten rock and gravitational mines. The creatures surged forward, only to be swallowed whole as the planet ripped itself apart, taking billions of abyssal horrors with it. In orbit above Dathis Prime, Admiral Rourke's fleet performed the impossible. Using synchronized gravity wells, his ships folded space around an advancing abyssal dreadform, trapping it in time. The monster, an entity that had consumed entire civilizations, struggled for mere seconds, then imploded as its own existence collapsed in on itself. And on the ruined colony of Velis 12, High Marshal Kane led a suicide battalion of resurrected shock troops, soldiers who, like him, had been brought back from death, their minds reforged into perfect warriors. They struck deep into the enemy's corruption, detonating pulse bombs that severed abyssal growths from their controlling hive minds. For the first time, the abyss reeled. It was working. But every victory came with a whisper. At first, it was nothing, an echo at the edges of their minds. The Revenant generals dismissed it as stress, as the residual effects of resurrection. But it grew worse. In the dead of night, Kane saw flickers of something moving in the darkness, watching him with hollow eyes. Voss heard voices, not human voices, calling her by name. Rourke, in the silence of his command chamber, stared into the endless abyss of space and felt it stare back. Then the dreams began. They were not memories, nor hallucinations. They were messages. Kane saw himself standing on a battlefield of shifting black sand, surrounded by the corpses of civilizations he did not recognize. Each time he looked down, his own hands were covered in abyssal corruption. Voss saw herself in a ruined war council, where figures made of shadow whispered plans that felt right, that felt necessary. Rourke's dream was the worst. He stood before a vast abyssal throne, and something that had his voice, spoke from it. You have already joined us. You just haven't accepted it yet. They told no one. The war demanded focus, and doubt was a weakness they could not afford. But the abyss had begun to change. It no longer threw itself mindlessly into their traps. It adapted faster, anticipated maneuvers before they were executed. It countered their strategies with a precision that should have been impossible. And then, during a decisive battle over the gas giant, Psycho 7, the truth became undeniable. The abyss spoke. Across every fleet channel, every communication relay, the same message echoed in 100 distorted voices. You are not their saviors. You are ours. The Revenant generals froze. The abyss knew them. And worse still, it remembered them. The words echoed long after the battle ended. You are not their saviors. You are ours. No one outside the Revenant generals understood the weight of that message. To the soldiers, to the Dominion's remaining leaders, it was nothing more than abyssal trickery, another attempt to unnerve the defenders of mankind. But Kane, Voss, and Rourke knew better, because the abyss wasn't just speaking. It was recognizing them. It had learned their tactics too fast, countered their strategies too precisely, and the whispers, the dreams, the feeling of something lurking beneath their resurrected minds. None of it had been paranoia. Something was wrong. And there was only one way to find out the truth. "We take the fight to it," Kane said, pacing the war chamber aboard the Dominion flagship Iron Will. "We stop waiting for it to attack. We go into the abyss itself." The room fell silent. Even the most hardened strategists hesitated at the suggestion. No ship had ever entered abyssal space and returned. The moment a fleet crossed the event horizon of those blackened rifts, it ceased to exist. Deleted from reality, its crew lost to something no science could explain. Voss crossed her arms. "You're suggesting we deliberately enter the one place where every recorded mission has ended in annihilation." "Not a suggestion," Kane corrected. "A necessity." Rourke exhaled slowly. "He's right." Maros, watching from the side of the room, shook his head. "No fleet has survived an abyssal incursion. You'd be committing suicide." "No." Kane turned, his gaze cold. "Normal humans die when they go in. We are not normal humans." That was the difference. The abyss had reached out to them. It knew them. It remembered them. Which meant that, somehow, they were already part of it. And that was something they could exploit. ####. The Iron Will led the assault force into the abyssal breach near the ruins of the Eridanus expanse. Thousands of warships had been lost in this rift before. The Dominion considered it a graveyard. Kane saw it as an opportunity. The moment they crossed into abyssal space, reality shifted. It was not empty, as scans had previously suggested. It was not a void. It was something else. A churning, living darkness stretched beyond the limits of perception. The stars above twisted into unfamiliar constellations. Time itself felt slower, heavier, as if they were moving through a substance thicker than space itself. And then the voices returned. Not whispers, not echoes. Voices. "You should not be here." The abyssal depths erupted with movement. From the shifting dark, shapes emerged, humanoid shapes, twisted warforms, their bodies bearing uncanny resemblances to the Revenant generals themselves. Rourke's hands clenched at the sight of a figure standing in the void, clad in abyss-forged battle armor identical to his own. It even held its weapon the same way. Voss stared at her own distorted reflection, its abyssal form smiling with something close to recognition. And Kane felt something inside him wake up. The abyss had not just remembered them. It had been waiting for them to come back. The abyssal reflections stood motionless in the void, their forms shifting like liquid shadow. The warships of the Dominion fleet hovered in uneasy silence, their weapons locked onto the abyss-born doppelgangers. No one fired. No one spoke. Then, in a voice that did not belong to him, but still somehow did, Kane's abyssal counterpart spoke. "You were never meant to return." A ripple of unease passed through the Revenant generals. These were not mindless horrors. These things knew them, down to the way they moved, the way they thought. This was not an enemy that needed to learn their tactics. It already had them. Before Kane could respond, a movement caught his eye. Admiral Rourke stepping forward, lowering his weapon. "Rourke," Voss said warily. But the Admiral was transfixed, staring at his abyssal mirror. The void around it pulsed in time with his own heartbeat, the connection undeniable. "They're not just reflections," Rourke murmured. His voice was calm. Too calm. "They're us." Kane's fingers tightened on his weapon. "Stand down, Rourke." Rourke didn't move. His abyssal double smiled. "You already understand. We are inevitable." A pulse of darkness surged from the abyss, washing over the fleet. In that moment, Kane felt it. Memories that weren't his, echoes of battles fought in another existence. A past where they had already joined the abyss, a future where they would again. That was when Rourke turned and fired. The plasma bolt caught Kane off guard, slamming into his shoulder armor. Synthetic flesh burned, pain receptors flaring. But he didn't fall. The fleet erupted into chaos. Half the Dominion warships, Orcs forces, immediately turned their weapons on their allies, abyssal corruption spreading through their hulls like a living disease. Pilots screamed as their own minds turned against them. Crews lost control of their bodies as something else took over. Rourke's voice crackled through the fleet's comms. "Stop resisting. This is the only way humanity survives." Voss barely dodged a strike from one of her own officers, now twisted by abyssal influence. She grabbed the traitor by the throat, crushing the infected soldier's windpipe with enhanced strength. "Rourke, what the hell are you doing?" Rourke's abyssal double stepped beside him, its expression eerily serene. "We cannot win this war, but we can become something greater." Kane gritted his teeth. "You bastard." But deep down, he understood. Rourke had always been the pragmatist, the strategist, and now he had seen what Kane refused to accept. The abyss was not an enemy to be fought. It was a force of nature, and nature could not be defeated. It could only be joined. But Kane wasn't going to let that happen. He slammed a fist against his command console, activating an emergency override. "All loyal ships, fall back. Get out of the breach. Now." Voss grabbed Kane's arm. "No retreat. We end this here." Kane's eyes burned with fury. Not a retreat. A trap. Because if the abyss wanted them so badly, then maybe, just maybe, it could be tricked into devouring itself. The abyssal breach roared as the battle escalated into full-scale war. Half the Dominion fleet, now corrupted under Rourke's command, twisted into monstrous forms. Organic metal plating, pulsing black tendrils lashing out from once pristine warships. The abyssal forces surged, overwhelming the Loyalists with impossible speed, fighting as though they already knew every countermeasure before it was deployed. But Kane and Voss were not men who fought fair fights. Kane's voice was cold and precise over the comms. "Execute Protocol Ragnarok." At his command, the Iron Will transmitted a single pulse across the fleet. Detonations erupted within the corrupted vessels, pre-planted failsafe charges hidden in their reactors, designed for this exact scenario. Rourke had taken half the fleet, but Kane had made sure that if any Dominion warship was ever compromised, it would not be turned against humanity. Explosions rippled through the void. Abyssal-infested ships ruptured from within, entire sections of their hulls collapsing before their monstrous forms could fully regenerate. But Rourke had anticipated this. From the abyss, tendrils of pure void energy latched onto the wounded ships, rebuilding them in real time. Rourke's voice cut through the comms, calm and knowing. "I was always the better strategist, Kane." Kane's hands clenched into fists. "You always thought small." Voss's forces tore through the battlefield, using scorched reality tactics the abyss had never encountered before. Her planetary warfare expertise translated into the void. She turned the wreckage of destroyed ships into moving fortresses, creating shifting kill zones where abyssal forces were funneled into relentless crossfire. But it wasn't enough. The abyss adapted too fast. They had minutes before total collapse. Kane and Voss exchanged a single glance. No words were needed. Phase 2. The Dominion warships suddenly pulled back, shifting their formation in a seemingly chaotic retreat. Rourke and his abyssal forces surged forward, thinking they had won. That was when Kane triggered the real trap. At the heart of the battlefield, a massive, dormant warship powered online. The Oblivion Lance, a prototype dreadnought carrying the most forbidden weapon humanity had ever created, the Omega Rift Annihilator, a device designed not to destroy matter, but to erase existence itself. "Fire," Kane ordered. The Oblivion Lance released a pulse of anti-reality energy. The abyssal corruption writhed in agony as the blast tore through space, not simply killing, but unmaking. Abyssal tendrils collapsed, their very essence stripped from existence. The affected warships didn't explode. They simply ceased to be. Rourke's voice came through the comms, not in rage, but in understanding. "So that's your answer." For the first time, the abyss hesitated. It feared. But before Kane could capitalize on that fear, something happened. The void shifted. A presence far greater than anything they had encountered before stirred in the depths. And then, the abyss spoke again. "You cannot kill what is already part of you." And Kane realized the truth. The abyss had never been trying to conquer them. It had been trying to bring them home. The void itself trembled. The abyss was no longer just attacking. It was reacting. The Omega Rift Annihilator had done something more than just destroy its forces. It had wounded the abyss in a way it had never experienced before. But it was not dying. It was awakening. The massive presence that loomed in the depths of the rift, something far older than the war, older than the Revenant generals, older than humanity itself, began to take form. It was not a ship. It was not an army. It was a consciousness, vast and incomprehensible, spreading across the void like a living thought. "You do not understand." Kane clenched his jaw as the words hammered through his mind, reverberating like thunder inside his skull. He looked to Voss. She was shaking, her breath uneven. The Dominion fleet around them struggled to hold formation, their systems flickering as abyssal interference surged through every neural interface. And Rourke stood aboard his abyssal warform, untouched by the chaos. His abyssal double now merged with him, their forms no longer separate. His voice came through the comms, filled with something that almost sounded like pity. "You still don't see it, Kane." Kane gritted his teeth. "See what?" "That you betrayed everything we fought for." Rourke exhaled. "No, that we were never fighting at all." The abyss pulsed, and suddenly the Revenant generals remembered. Their deaths. Their first deaths. Not on battlefields long past, not against forgotten enemies, but here, in the abyss. They had died in this war before, and every time the abyss had brought them back, reforging them, sending them back to humanity to prepare them for the inevitable. They were never just warriors. They were conduits. Voss stumbled back, gripping the edge of the command console, her voice barely a whisper. No, that's not possible." Kane felt it now, the truth that had been hiding inside him since the moment he was resurrected. They were never meant to win this war. They were meant to become it. Rourke's voice was steady. "We are not humanity's last hope. We are its first evolution." The abyss's presence loomed closer, enveloping the battlefield. The surviving Dominion ships desperately tried to pull back, but their engines faltered under the sheer gravitational force of the rift. There was no escape. And then, the abyss offered its final choice. Return to us, or be forgotten. Kane's fingers hovered over the Omega Rift Annihilator's trigger. The weapon was still primed. Another blast could erase everything, including himself, Voss, Rourke, and every abyssal force within range. A final act of defiance. But he hesitated, because deep down, in the part of him that had always known, he realized, if he fired again, he wouldn't just be destroying the abyss. He would be destroying himself. Voss looked to him, waiting. Rourke stood silent, watching. And Kane, the greatest warrior humanity had ever known, had to decide. To fight for a war that had already been lost, or to finally accept what he had always been.